Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we're set to deliberate the latest developments here in Israel, throughout the region and beyond, with chief focus, first and foremost, on the situation in the Netherlands, the capital Amsterdam, where we saw abhorrent actions by Islamist criminals targeting Israeli soccer fans. We will hear just momentarily more about that. We will focus, of course, also on the Islamic Republic of Iran, the much anticipated transition of power in Washington in a couple of months. Where are we heading to? What are the implications? And, of course, also on the Gaza Strip and Lebanon. But before all that, let's always remember how this war began. 399 days ago, on October 7th of last year, the Islamist Hamas and its affiliates in the Gaza Strip launched a surprise onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 250 people, roughly, including elderly, men, women, children, and infants. 101 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. The subsequent day, Iran essentially joined that war when it greenlighted its Iranian proxy in Lebanon, namely Hezbollah, to launch cross-border attacks against Israel. Since then, it launched over 12,000 projectiles towards Israeli territory, and not Hezbollah alone. Additional Iranian proxies in Syria, as well as in Iraq and Yemen, have also launched towards Israel, including Iran proper, twice, and yet again, it is remaining, at least vocally so, poised on launching yet another attack against Israel. Let's now turn to central Israel, where we're joined by Brigadier General in Reserve Yaron Rosen, formerly the IDF Chief of Cyber Staff, an Israel Air Force commander, as well as a fighter pilot. It's good to see you, General. I'd like to start with focusing on the Netherlands. A day or 2 days since tomorrow is the commemoration of Kristallnacht, something that, of course, we all remember, the deliberate attacks by, back then, a mob of Nazis in Nazi Germany targeting Jews wherever they may be. Yet again, it provides us a very chilling moment in remembering that this is not over. Namely, it might not be Nazis, this time it's Islamists, but nonetheless, hatred is there, and this threat against the Jews may well turn against Europeans before we know it.
Yeah, if you look at what's going on, it's absolutely crazy to think that a little over 70 years ago, this looked almost the same. I think the huge confusion between progressive ideas and what is just, what is right, is just really very, very sad to see where Europe is right now and how low it went with this issue. I think that you may look at the New York Times headline after after last night's attack this morning, which also surprised me and also is maybe it's not surprising, actually, when you think about it. The headline states about violence after a football match. Oh, who was the violence between? Who was the target? It almost seems like just people came out of a soccer game and started fighting because of the soccer match. That is exactly the progressive ideas that are so confusing for these young people. And as I know, just from initial information that's coming in, this was again instigated, sort of paid for, pushed for, organized, and sadly the Amsterdam authorities did not understand fully how real the threat was. And I know that an hour ago or so, the last two missing young men were found. Gladly, I don't know the situation health-wise for all of them, but this is a grim moment for a European capital.
Absolutely. Over 12 Israelis sustained various degrees of injuries. But nonetheless, this is terror. This is the definition of terror. let's now turn to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by uh, Mr. Marshall Billingsley, formerly the Assistant Secretary General of NATO and U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for countering terror financing, and a long list of other positions. First of all, it's great to see you, but I'd like to ask you particularly about the situation in Amsterdam. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu highlighted the necessity, or he instructed Mossad to prepare for contingencies in future events, be it in soccer matches, basketball matches, and other events. Is that something that a country can prepare for at a time when, of course, dealing with an ally that is challenged by a very violent group of people who have not integrated into Western society? They despise Western civilization at large, but nonetheless, they are exploiting democracy for their own interests.
Well, if any country can do it, it's the state of Israel. Um, the government of Israel has a long history of successfully protecting its athletes, certainly post Munich, protecting the broader Jewish population and all of the fans that attend these sporting events is probably something that cannot be done unilaterally by the state of Israel. It's something that very much does need host nation support. Hopefully, the horrific events of last night's pogrom in Amsterdam will serve as a wake-up call across Europe. Uh, I'm sad to say that we've seen in the United States our own massive uptick in anti-Semitic violence and stunningly, crowds of professionally, in some cases, Iranian-funded. We know that Iranian-funded agitators waving Hezbollah, Hamas flags, even Al Qaeda flags. So we are in a dangerous environment, and I think the prime minister is very wise to have instructed the Mossad, as you say he did.
Indeed. Well, I think it's also important to highlight uh, a fact. The Israeli flag was burned in Amsterdam last night by those Islamists. More than 30 have already been arrested, all of them being from Turkey, from Iran, from Morocco. So those people are not Dutch, indigenous. In any sense, for that matter, except for holding maybe a nationality or residency, but I don't have that information as of yet. Let's now turn to the Middle East, because the situation here in the Middle East is no less intense. General Rosen, a change of guard in Israel's defense establishment. Israel Katz takes office at the expense of Yoav Gallant, who was until this morning actually Israel's defense minister. And it seems like this transition is going very smoothly, with Israel Katz also announcing that he will frequently come to General Gallant for advice on all matters of defense. And therefore, the question, to what degree is this really a transition, or rather just a political change in order to enable other developments?
I think the change is meaningful. I think it has many aspects that we can look at. I mean, at the end of the day, if you think about it, this is the first ministerial level change since October 7th. No one has taken responsibility and resigned. So Bibi had the honor to fire his own Minister of Defense after a long time. He wanted to do that for various reasons, most of them political. And I think Gallant did a good job after October 7th in reinstating the confidence of the IDF and the high ranks to, pick themselves up and, take lead in the war in Gaza, and now in the last months in the war in the north. And I think he did a good job with that. And mostly in his last days and weeks as Minister of Defense, I think he stood up to his values, even if they're not Likud values. He stood up to his values. He spoke up about the need of the ultra Orthodox to join the ranks and to join the IDF, which is a huge debate now internally, because this is no more an issue of only values and is this important or that important? It's just a bare necessity to bring more soldiers to the IDF. It's very simple. Israel was never built for long wars. It was built for a short war that started with the regular army, and the reserve army are supposed to support a few weeks, decisive win, push to the enemy side, and then something comes out of it, and the working class, which is the reservists, go back and the economy goes back to work. But how long can you hold this war with all of the working class going back and forth into their reserve duty for 120 days, 30 days off, 60 days off, and going back? We're not a country of a national guard. This is a very different, situation. This is everyone is a reservist. So this is really disrupting the economy. So, if the government doesn't take the really, really well-achieved blows that the IDF has struck both in Gaza and Hezbollah and Iran, and turns it into a diplomatic victory, this will be a very, very heavy burden for Israel writ large, like as a nation.
Thank you, General Yaron. Just one remark before we turn to Mr. Billingsley. The governor of the Bank of Israel said that if the war ends by the end of Q1 or the beginning or mid second quarter of 2025, the economy of Israel will immediately get back to a point of 3.8% of GDP. So it seems like the horizon is going to improve. Israel is very good in emerging, at least from an economic perspective, out of wars. That is something that I think is at least a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. And Mr. Billingsley, I'd like to hear your take on this transition of power, basically the change of the guard, let's call it that, for the position of defense minister in Israel. To what degree is that going to impact the communications with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, currently in Washington? And of course, not before too long, he's also going to be replaced. Is this going to challenge the comms between the two sides?
Well, in democracies, ministers and secretaries and presidents and prime ministers come and go, but the longstanding friendship between the United States, the cultural ties with Israel, the shared history with the state of Israel, are so deep that they really do transcend any particular set of personalities. I do think the new defense minister is clearly going to have the need to establish close relationships with two secretaries of defense in short order, since Austin will inevitably be replaced and there'll be a whole new team at the Pentagon. What I think is perhaps more important is to look at the fact that the relationship between Netanyahu and Biden and Harris, well, with Harris, it's been non-existent. And with Biden, it's been a very strained relationship. I expect a much closer, warmer relationship between the prime minister and President Trump, and a set of shared priorities and values. I think Netanyahu probably is now relieved that these threats of an arms embargo are in the distant rearview mirror. I think that the state of Israel, which has realized that it needs to reinvigorate its own capacity to produce certain categories of munitions and not be reliant on others, I think the United States will wholeheartedly support that. I would look to see immediate improvement in the relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the pursuit of additional Abraham Accords. I think the United States will want to see an end to hostilities in the Middle East, but it will want to do so. The Trump administration will want to see an end on terms that are favorable and advantageous to Israel and highly disadvantageous to Iran and its terrorist proxies.
Indeed. If I may stay with you, Marshall, the last time around when Trump came into office in 2016, you actually headed the transition team for Trump for the National Security Council. While we won't go into, of course, who may be the head of the transition team where, except for Brian Hook, who, of course, has been publicized by all media, I'd like to ask you whether or not it's a signal that the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran under the Trump administration that led the maximum pressure campaign, which you were a very integral part of, being in charge of preparing the sanctions themselves. Is that a signal to the Islamic Republic? And if so, to what degree should the Iranians be concerned?
Well, I think the Iranians should be greatly concerned if they don't cease and desist in their behavior. And it is an absolute signal. But it's a signal, I think, based on the priority that President Trump attached to the maximum economic pressure campaign and the decision to withdraw from the JCPOA, that he and Brian Hook are clearly, very close. And so Brian enjoys that vote of confidence in leading the State Department, the diplomatic transition process. There are multiple other transition teams at work, including, as you mentioned, for the National Security Council, for the Department of Defense, and so on. But our diplomatic posture, as we deal in a really violent world with two wars currently waging, one in the Middle East, one in Ukraine, and a third war potentially looming in Asia, our diplomatic posture is of the utmost importance, and making sure that we have the highest caliber people serving in those key jobs is essential.
Vital indeed. General Rosen, your take on the U.S.-Israel relations. Obviously, the defense establishment has a working relationship with their counterparts in Washington, irrespective of the administration. Nonetheless, there are challenges that reemerged time and again during those past 13 months now of fighting between the Islamist Hamas and Israel, between Iran and Israel, with various constraints and limitations. Is there a certain glimmer of hope with regard to the removal of those constraints to be able to once again align, of course, in collaboration, close collaboration, that is, with the Trump administration with regard to whatever needs to be done versus the adversaries and enemies of both the United States and Israel?
I think, as Marshall mentioned, I think the working level in between two militaries, CENTCOM namely, and the IDF is super close. I mean, it hasn't been it can almost not go any better. It's a very, very close relationship, all levels, from the combatant commander all the way down to the ranks, and everybody's working together in a way which is absolutely vital to the defense of Israel, and not only to the defense, to the offensive capacities from intelligence and other capabilities and needs in the Middle East. The arena is super complex, and I think the working level will just continue to work. That's what I hope for. Will just continue to work. What I think will change is the higher level atmosphere, of course, and that means a lot. Okay, the policies will change. And most importantly, and this is what I hope will happen between the political level and the military levels. I think the convergence of the strategy, the overarching strategy. Where are we going? Where do we want to reach? I think the former Trump administration did a much better job in setting the vision for the region, namely the Abrahamic Accords, as they came to fruition. I think that mostly what we heard in the last year was de-escalation, and that de-escalation is not a strategy. You don't de-escalate to de-escalate. It has to serve some kind of purpose, and I think that if the political levels feel much more comfortable to start talking about the long-term strategy and ideas that can lead to this stability and what we want, this will be very important for the Middle East and also for the United States, because the United States and Israel, they work on two separate planes. Israel works on the regional level. It's a regional player. We're not a global player. All we want is to have a stable, prosperous Middle East with whoever wants to be friends with us. But the United States has to project power globally, namely for stability on a global level vis-a-vis the Asia, Taiwan, the Straits of Taiwan, and Taiwan itself, and China. These things are very important for the United States anyway. The way the Biden administration projected power in the Middle East was completely counterproductive to the United States interest in Ukraine vis-a-vis Iran and Russia, and in the Far East vis-a-vis Taiwan and China. Whatever the United States does on a global level projects to all 360 degrees. Everybody understands what's going on. And for that reason, we're in this twilight diplomacy now, because everybody understands that things are going to change gladly in the way they should change for the whole world.
Indeed, there is a realignment of policy and outlook, if I may call it that, with regard to that from Washington and from Jerusalem, as well as other partners and allies in the region, including, as Mr. Billingsley mentioned, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Mr. Billingsley, we don't have very much time left. Nevertheless, what would be the key challenges that the United States will have to deal with on the first day in office? For instance, maritime shipping in the Red Sea is still very much obstructed by the belligerence of the Iranian proxy Ansar Allah, dominated, of course, by the Houthi tribe. Is that something that the United States would take on itself as part of Task Force 153 or any of the other shipping or naval missions that have been established in the past year?
At the tactical level, the Houthis would be well advised to immediately cease and desist and plead for mercy. I think more broadly, the bigger theme here that I want to leave with you, and I want to pick up on what General Rosen just said, because he's exactly right, is the current administration has done nothing but project weakness around the world, and it has incentivized aggression. So one of the themes I suspect you will hear from the incoming Trump administration is that we intend to restore deterrence at all levels. And I expect that President Trump, we all know his ability to do things like take out Qasem Soleimani, the going eye to eye with the North Koreans over their nuclear testing is another good example. He will, I believe, surround himself with people, with policymakers who are not so easily self-deterred the way Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken and others have been. The other point that I would just like to remind people, and this goes back to something Yaron said previously, everyone remembers that President Trump was the first president to actually follow through and move our embassy to Jerusalem. What many people don't actually realize is he also had the foresight to bring Israel into Central Command.
Right.
I actually shudder to think how complicated and perhaps impossible some of the coordination would have been had he not done that. The ability of Central Command to work with the State of Israel to protect against multiple salvos of Iranian ballistic missiles, of cruise missiles, of drones, really was not possible under the structure that was previously in place until President Trump changed it.
If the US election would have been determined by foreign policy rather than domestic policy, the numbers would have exceeded the 3% popular vote in favor of the Trump administration on all levels, if I may add, since the United States you were talking about moving the state of Israel from EUCOM to CENTCOM. There is, of course, the ongoing tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia, the Renaissance Dam, which the Trump administration was very keen on resolving back then. There was, of course, the whole situation between Kosovo and Serbia. There are other challenges that were with Qatar and the GCC. We can go on and on and on, let alone, of course, the Abraham Accords, which was a phenomenal success. In half a sentence from each of you, What are we to focus on for this weekend ahead? General Wazin, we'll start with you.
I think going off what we just heard, I think I'll use an entrepreneurial term, an MVP. I think that as stated about the Houthis that need to just stand down, the new administration needs to pick the most viable Middle Eastern threat and make an example, and the rest will be history. That's what the United States has done before. I think we spoke about it here on the show in 1988 on the Iranian Navy after a U.S. Navy ship, I think, was hit by a underwater mine, and it made its point very clearly.
Right.
And the same moving forward. We need an MVP to be demonstrated how the future looks like. And I think everybody will fall in place. That's deterrence, and that's where we need to be in the future. And I think it's going to come much faster than we think.
Mr. Billingsley?
Well, I agree with that. And the Houthis so far seem to be volunteering for that role. Certainly, it has not escaped anyone's attention in Washington, the harm that they've done. I think more broadly, and you are seeing it in the press here in the United States, but I do think the reporting that the maximum economic pressure campaign against Iran will come back in force. I expect that. Obviously, Iran has raked in $130 billion in revenue under the Biden administration because they've refused to enforce the sanctions. That will take an enormous amount of time and effort. It is not easy, I will tell you, to enforce those sanctions, but it is very doable. However, should Iran make the mistake of again attacking Israel, I hope the government of Israel will make our job here in the United States much easier by flattening the oil infrastructure.
Absolutely. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Wazin and Mr. Billingsley for all of your insights. I'd like to thank all of you at home as well, and immediately also wish you a Shabbat Shalom. For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at TV7Israelnews.com.